All right, so I got the starter out. Um, it's kind of hard to do when you've had shoulder surgery. I've said it a couple times before on this channel. You know, God only gives you one body, take care of it, and that's definitely true. I had a bit of struggle to get my arm over my head. Um, Now I'm taking the drive shaft out, but before I get it all the way out, I'm going to mark it so that whenever I put it back in, I can get it aligned the way it is. If your drive shaft's not making noise, do this. If it is making noise, take it and get it balanced. But the drive shaft's working great in this truck. I don't want to, put it in 180 out and all of a sudden develop a whoop whoop whoop. So I'm gonna mark it real quick. All right, I've got a quick tool recommendation here. A couple different flywheel holders you can get. The cheap ones have this welded on tab here. I can't tell you how many times that tab is bent outward, slipped off the flywheel, and I've punched myself in the face with this thing. These are garbage. The better, higher dollar one has a cast piece here with a hook on the end, and this one doesn't slip. It works really well. I have yet to punch myself in the face with it. I recommend getting one of the higher dollar ones that don't have the welded on tip on it, made out of cheap steel. So, quick tip there. While I have the starter out, a couple quick things on starters, especially for GMs. This is the permanent magnet starter, the old style. Big, bulky, heavy, and they're not as reliable, not as good as the smaller, lighter weight gear reduction starters. First off, it's a whole lot of weight on the nose, and it tends to pull on these bolts, and it can crack your transmission bell housing if you don't have the support bracket there. I don't have the support bracket. I don't know where it went for this truck. Basically, I just had the truck together I had Way Cool Jr. together to get it running, and I knew this stuff was coming back apart sometime soon. I've got a rear main seal leak. The transmission, I knew the transmission was a junkyard transmission to get it by while I rebuilt another transmission, and so I knew it was all coming back out. I'm going to replace this with a gear reduction starter. I've got one over here on my cheap rebuild engine that I've been meaning to fire up. But your starter bolts are important also. You can't use normal bolts to hold your starter on. If you look, there's a knurl and a slightly wider section, and that helps center your starter up onto the block. If you try using normal, set this down, this thing's really heavy. If you try using normal bolts, your starter can walk around, it can cause problems. You can knock a tooth off your flywheel or flex plate. So keep track of these bolts. If you lose them, go to pull apart and grab some and see if you can find some laying around. If you go to pull apart, the starter's probably already gone, especially the gear reduction starters. Somebody's robbed them. But if you look on the ground nearby, I'll bet you'll find the bolts, because people don't think to take these with them. Get these bolts, get the right bolts. Buy them from someone if you have to. Use the right bolts to hold your starter on, it matters. So here's a quick comparison in the size of the starters. This one, lightweight. Big difference. These actually are more effective at starting than these big monsters. It was, an improvement they made in the 80s, and it's one of those things that you just don't look back and miss these. They're not that good. These are great. If you can get the gear reduction starter, get it. All right, so got the old transmission out, and the transmission was running fine, except it wouldn't always shift real. If I gave it more than a third throttle, the shift wouldn't complete. It would hang up between shifts. And that's not a sign of internal failure. It's not a sign of the transmission. It's not a sign of the TV cable wearing out the transmission extra fast or anything like that. It's a sign of the front pump being weak. So because of that, I'm not really concerned about the torque converter being bad. And I'm going to reuse the torque converter. I'm going to put it straight in the newly rebuilt transmission. But if you've done much work on transmissions, you've heard of the 3 clunks. And some people swear by it and some people swear at it. But the truth is, the 3 clunk method of installing a torque converter works. You can put a torque converter on and not get one of those 3 clunks if everything lines up. If you put the torque converter in and you only hear 2 clunks and it can't go any further, pull it back out and start over. If you make sure that you get 3 clunks when you install a converter, it's going to be okay. The other thing is when you get it in there and you go to bolt it up, make sure you've got room to slide that torque converter forward and back to get the bolts lined up and in. If it's real close, real tight, and you're having trouble getting any kind of clearance in there, pull it back out. Restab the torque converter. See if maybe you thought you got 3 clunks and you didn't. But I'm going to go ahead and swap the torque converters over now between the two transmissions. This transmission here is a junkyard transmission I got from LKQ. I really don't like LKQ. Our local pull apart is awesome, excellent, love those guys. LKQ's high priced and they don't clean their yard at all. It's junky. The pull apart is much better managed and cheaper prices. But I got this, it was a junkyard transmission. It was missing the oil pan, but it had the valve body still on the transmission. And I took a chance on it, and it's run good for a couple of years, but like I said, the front pumps wore out on it. So there's a good chance I'll end up going through this transmission. If I do that, I'm going to try to be really in-depth and detailed, show which way the lip seals go, and I'll shoot a video on it, because when I went to rebuild the other transmission, there was not enough tech data. I watched 2 different videos, I've got 3 different books, and it was underwhelming, the information I got for rebuilding my transmission. So let me grab this other transmission and slide it up here, and I'll start doing the torque converter clunks. These are 4L60s or 700R4s. They are not electronically controlled. They have a TV cable. They are not a strong transmission. They're really suited to the V6 trucks, but they did put them in the V8s. I don't mind them, but you just got to know what it's for. It's not for heavy towing, so if you're making a tow pig, you don't want a 4L60. Way-Cool Jr. has always been intended to be a light-duty tow pig at best. The motor is pretty stout, and so the transmission is going to be the weak link if anything goes out on this truck. But I'm pretty easy on transmission, so I didn't worry about it when I put it in. So if you see here, I don't know if you can see with the camera, there's a spline gear here, a spline gear here, and what you don't see inside the transmission, what you do see here is 2 notches. So whenever you do the 3 clunks, you're basically getting onto this gear, then onto this gear, and then getting this to fit in between the teeth to slide in. Now, I can tell you that seal there is probably dry, so I'm going to make sure I've got some fluid on the outside of this before I try to spline it in there. Now, this transmission I built probably a little over a year ago. It may be getting near 2 years. It sure is dusty like it's been a while. And I just haven't had an opportunity I haven't really needed to take this transmission out of Way-Cool Jr. until now. But this transmission is weak enough now where I'm kind of scared to drive it anywhere. It makes me wonder if I'm going to get home with it. Also, make sure your little seal here on the front is in good shape. There's a little seal on the end of the fitting there. You don't want to nick it. Okay, 1, 2, 3. 3 clunks. And if you can see, the torque converter is back from the flange, from the bell housing surface here. So I know the torque converter is in all the way at that point. That's the 3 clunks. That's all there is to it. It's not rocket science. If you're careful about it, make sure you get 3 clunks. You're not going to destroy your torque converter or your flex plate or whatever. So now I got to mop up under the truck and see if I can figure out where the oil's coming from. See if it is a rear main seal leak or if it's an oil pan leak or what. All right, so I got the flex plate off, and the back side and the front side, this thing is bone dry. So my issue is not a rear main seal leak. It's the oil pan leaking. The back 2 nuts on the oil pan loosen themselves up. So I may have to see about getting some lock nuts to put on there. But that's what I found. Nice drip of oil from the oil pan itself, but the rear main seal is dry. So that's a good diagnosis. That's I can see that it's nothing. I was scared that maybe I did something with the rear main seal and nicked it or something. And that'd be a little bit more work. I'd have to pull the oil pan down and pull that apart. As it is, I can just tighten up the two nuts on the back of the oil pan, and I think that'll fix my oil leak. So I'm gonna get some Loctite on these bolts and get it back on there. And it's a matter of stabbing the new transmission in there, which is gonna be a pain. The cross member I built for this truck makes it kind of a pain to move. I can't really move the cross member forward and back a whole lot. It's kind of in the way that it's basically what my first attempt at ever making something to hold the transmission, and it's worked so far, and it gives me clearance for the exhaust, which is my issue. But it's going to make it challenging to get that transmission up in there, so we'll see. When it comes to your torque converter bolts, always use thread locker. Be careful with thread locker. If you get it in your eye, do not try to open your eye again. Go to the emergency room, and they'll have stuff to get your eye back open. If you get this in your eye and you shut your eye and you try to open your eye, you can tear your cornea. You have to be careful using thread locker. But put just a nice bead on here, just one line, and then thread it in, and your bolts are good and locked. So just beware when you're putting it on. Don't be under the bolt. Be to the side, and then bolt these on. Make sure you put thread locker on every single bolt that goes in your torque converter. You don't want these coming back out. At the least, they'll score everything in there as they work their way out. They'll rub against stuff and tear up your bell housing. But yeah, get thread locker on them, get them tight. So, which reminds me, I need to look at the torque spec. I can't remember the torque spec on these. All right, torque spec on these is actually kind of high. It's about 65 foot-pounds. That's more than I would imagine for a bolt like that, but these are grade 8 bolts, so it's not out of this world. So I'm gonna get my torque wrench out. I'm gonna put the stripe of thread locker on there and bolt them in. Be careful not to drop your torque wrench. Set it down. Dropping it can throw off the calibration. I'm going to thread these in halfway, and then one at a time I'm going to pull them back out, lock them, and thread them in. I'm not going to seat them all the way in before, because I don't want to make a mistake of thinking that one's been locked and it's not. So, the torque converter clutch in this transmission is currently controlled by the computer. The computer's not doing anything hardly anymore. I've got a Holley Sniper on here, so the computer's not running the fuel injection, it's not running the ignition. But it is making the torque converter clutch work, and it works great. But I want to get rid of the computer. I want to take that out. And so there's this little switch here you can get. It's a TCI component. There, I don't know if you can read the part number there. It's kind of, I've had this bag for a little while, but it's a vacuum switch. And whenever your engine sees, or whenever this switch sees a high vacuum, meaning that you're not romping on the throttle, and it sees enough pressure in the pressure solenoid in the valve body, it'll engage torque converter clutch. Now, early 700 R4s don't have this extra solenoid or this extra pressure switch, but the 4L60s, some of them do. And whenever I rebuilt this transmission, this one has it. So I've just got a wire. Basically, I run a power wire from a key on hot to this switch down to the terminal on the transmission to this switch. And whenever both these switches engage, it'll lock the torque converter clutch. And then if either one of them opens up, it'll take power away from torque converter clutch, and the transmission will open up. I'll get torque multiplication. So I've been meaning to do this for a long time. I'm not sure that I'm going to get this done with the installation. This may be a wiring job later on, because basically I just have to run the wires for it, and it should work. But we'll see. Well, I'm at a stopping point. I thought I'd replace this rear transmission mount whenever I put the transmission in a couple of years ago, and I did not. This thing is falling apart. It's not what I want to put. I mean, everything I've done on this truck so far has been putting new stuff on it, or better condition stuff. I've been, I rebuilt the suspension on it, I rebuilt the engine on it, I rebuilt the transmission, And some of the stuff I did, to get by with, and this is one of the things I did to get by with, I don't want to put this back on. I'm at the point now where I'm only putting good new parts on this truck. So this is pretty much trash. I'm gonna have to go get one and